Greek, Roman, Byzantine, Chinese sources on the Bulgarians, their related peoples and synonymous names. The national substrate of the Bulgarians in Eurasia and the Balkans. 2:1 First written records of the tribes of the Black Sea and Danube. The study and explanation of the history and population of the Eurasian forest steppes and semideserts has no earlier insight than the time of the Scythians, according to traditional historiography. And this time of the Scythians turns out to be quite a stretch. According to archaeological data, the flowering of the so-called Scythian culture by traditional science falls somewhere around the 8th century BC. Quantitative and qualitative indicators in household objects and religious magical practice show an Edio superiority, both over older analogues and, surprisingly, over more recent historical periods. Perhaps because synchronous processes of flourishing of the then Mediterranean and Near Eastern civilizations were underway in those times. However, and despite the emergence of Greek writing at the time, the historical and geographical horizon of the Eurasian steppes remained somewhat monotonous. According to the hitherto known sources, the old Greek writers and historians, one speaks of the Scythians, before them of the Cimmerians, and before them again of the Scythians. The Scythians inhabited everything from the Carpathian Mountains in the west, to the Urals and Siberia in the east, to the Iranian plateau and the high mountain ranges of Indochina, and to the seas in the north. If we think traditionally, it would be naive that under the single name Scythians, there should stand a single people, or a multitude of tribes of one nationality, or close nationalities. But why has antiquity failed to differentiate them by more than this one name? A plausible explanation of the ethnonym Scythians is given in the Bulgarian annals, Jagfartari, that it is derived from the Kipchaks, who conquered the Cimmerian lands, and in Greek they were sounded as Scythians. The Kipchaks were an offshoot of the Bulgarian nationality. Another explanation for the origin of the very name of the country, Scythia, derives from the Bulgarian Askip, Bulgarian field or steppe. The ancient Bulgarian word kip is also present in the Greek language, as kipos, garden, absolutely similar meanings for silted spaces. And again in the annals it is said that all so-called Scythians have Bulgarian origin. The Cimmerians appeared in the Black Sea according to the Greek sources in the 10th century, and according to the Bulgarian annals they are German-speaking tribes, Goths, Cimmerians, Cimbri, Teutons, who arrived from Scandinavia and the Baltic as early as the 3rd millennium BC, and some of them under the name of Hittites settled in Asia Minor, being heavily Bulgarized. 2:2 Omir and Strabon on the history and geography of the Balkan Peninsula, Black Sea, Caspian, Asia Minor, and Central Asia. The first written accounts in Greek of the Scythian population on the northern Black Sea coast are given by Homer in the Odyssey. His contribution is most synthetically commented by Strabo, a famous late antique geographer who lived 1st century BC AD. I have to quote in great detail Strabo's geographic and historical descriptions of the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea and the Balkan Peninsula, the places where the life, history and culture of the indigenous populations, mainly called Cimmerians, Scythians and Sarmatians, Thracians, Mysians, Gatai, Dacians, Illyrians, Goths and Vandals, which I consider to be the national substratum and constituent part of the Bulgarian people and nation. As will be seen, the ancient and medieval chroniclers then relied too heavily on Strabo, who also for us contemporaries from today's point of view of knowledge of geography turns out to be reliable. All later documents and historical facts would draw heavily on the foundational data of Strabo's geography. In order to be more aware of the places where historical events will be played out, where many topoi, ethnonyms, and legends are mentioned, I think it will be useful to read it in detail in the parts concerning our subject. With regard to the origin of the tribes inhabiting the Balkan Peninsula and ancient Hellas, in the opinion of one branch of historians, they were of Near and Indo-European origin, migrating from the north to the south and later receiving the ethnonym Hellenes. According to the account of the ancient Greeks, in the middle of the 6th millennium BC their lands were inhabited by the most ancient tribe known to them, the Pelasgians. The displacement and assimilation of the Pelasgians to the south continued for about 1,000 years, during the Copper and Bronze Ages, the period of the breakdown of the patrilineal system and the emergence of slaveholding relations. The Bulgarian vault Jagfartario tells us that during the time of the ruler Bish in the 3rd millennium BC, many Bulgarians of the tribe Bilsaga, Pelasgi, or Bishatar, from their Bashatar, Bastani, came out of Idle. One part of them settled in Kara Saklan, Ukraine, another in Mikan Imshina, where they built the city of Bilsaga, Pylos, a third in the Caucasus, where their neighbors called them Huti, Keti, or Utiji, a fourth in Kashan, Central Asia, where they later divided into Tagars, Sagdaks, Marsguts and Kashans, and a fifth in Ulugh-Kin, India. The Houthis established a large kingdom that subjugated almost all of Samar, except Mamil. In the reign of Saklan, daughter of Kar, the Ishtiaki Bulgarians, led by Askell, returned from the Seven Rivers, but the queen allowed only the people of his son, Boyon, Mayan, whom she had married, to settle in Idle. Then Askell's other son, Kresh, or Baluan, went far away and settled on the island of Kresh, Crete. The Mokhidan, Balkan, Bulgars, dissatisfied with the rule of the Etrian, Troyan, Bulgars, passed under his authority. Under map, 2nd millennium BC, some of the Idlak Saga Bulgarians from the district of Mishen, who were also called Agathari, Agachiri, Misheni, Kimeri, boatmen, shipwrights, because of their skill in building vessels and sailing with them, migrated south. One part of the Agathari Kimeri settled in Kara Saklan, Ukraine, another subdued the Sebri and Bilsaga in Mikan, Balkans, a third tried to restore the Sumerian state, but was defeated by the Mamluks. The Mikan Agathiri conquered Kresh, then Atriac, Mamil and Angle Samar, but after suffering great losses from the wars, they themselves were defeated by the Turs, Dorians, note of the author, who came from Galij. After some time the Bulgarian ruler Elspar defeated the Turs, forced them to flee from Galids to the Mokhidan Bulgarians, the Agathars, who enslaved them and called them Serbians. But when the Agathars lost their strength in the wars, this enslaved tribe summoned their countrymen from Galij and together with them conquered Makena. The Bulgarian chronicles say that the Bulgarians, the Avars, the Hyksos, conquered Libya sometime in the middle and 2nd millennium BC. After the Trojan War there was a westward displacement of the Etrian, Trojan, Bulgarians to the Apennine Peninsula, and this explains the appearance of the Etruscans, Atrians. In the Greco-Roman epic and the Aeneid it is said that this happened under the leadership of Aeneas. The ethnonym Tyrrhenians is directly connected with the Tyrians, or Turbasi in the Bulgarian annals. In Strabo's descriptions of Italy, he explains where the Tyrrhenians and Etruscans came from in the region of Tyrrhenia. Tyrrhenia begins from its Tyrrhenian Sea and the Tiber River and reaches to the foothills of the mountains stretching from Liguria to the Adriatic Sea. The Romans called the Tyrrhenians Etruscans and Turks. According to the tradition of the Greeks, they were so called after Tyrannus, the son of Atheus, who from Libya sent settlers here. On account of a famine of infertility, the descendant of Heracles and Omphalos, Atheus, who had 2 sons, by lot left one son in Libya, and the second Tyrannus with the greater part of his people emigrated to this district, which he called Tyrrhenia, and built 12 cities. As builder he appointed Tarchon, whose name was given to the city of Tarquinia. As for the Pelasgians, almost everyone agrees that in ancient times such a tribe established itself throughout Greece, especially over the Aeolians in Thessaly. Ephorus, on the other hand, asserts that they were Arcadians to begin with, chose the life of warriors, and accustomed many others to that way of life, imposed their name on all, became quite famous among the Greeks and among other peoples whom they never happened to reach. And as Homer says, they had indeed settled in Crete too. Odysseus said to Penelope, "There is heard a mixture of tongues, here of Achaeans, there of Eteocrites proud, here of Sidonians, there of Dorians divided into 3 families, the wondrous Pelasgians." Thessaly, between the mouth of the Peneus and Thermopylae to the slopes of the Pindus, is called Pelasgian Argos, because the Pelasgians ruled that region. And the poet calls the Dodonian Zeus Pelasgian, Zeus of Dodona, Pelasgian. And many have called the tribes of Epirus Pelasgian, because they thought that their power extended as far as them. And since many heroes were called by Pelasgian names, the people after them called many peoples by these names. Thus Lesbos was called Pelasgia, and Homer calls the Cilicians of Troas Pelasgi. Hippoter led a tribe of spear-bearing Pelasgi, who inhabited lush Larissa. Anticlides relates that the Pelasgians first settled the places about Limnos and Imbros, and that a part of them, headed by Tyrannus, the son of Atheus, settled in Italy. The writers of the history of Attis report the coming of the Pelasgians to Athens, but as they were nomadic tribes, and like birds flew over places wherever they happened to be, they were called by the inhabitants of Attica Pelages, storks. Strabo gives accounts that will correspond to the identity of the descriptions of the tribes inhabiting these lands from Homer's time to the historical evidence of antiquity and later into the early Middle Ages. He describes curious events and reports much evidence arguing that these ethnic groups had similar manners and customs. Suggests clearly enough that there is a tradition and inheritance of customs, lifestyles of related ethnic groups. Strabo designates Homer as the founder of history and geography, who surpass men ancient and contemporary to Strabo not only by the dignity of his poetry, but also by his experience in public life, by the communication of many geographical and historical facts for the use of future generations. To the world, Homer is the famous ancient Aedes, author of the Iliad and the Odyssey. An acquaintance with the Bulgarian annals may now cast serious doubt on this, for it is evident that Homer was an old Bulgarian name, Oymir, borne by women. The mere knowledge of the geography of Scythia, the Euxine Pontus, of the Propontis, Colchis and the march of the Argonauts, of the Cimmerian Bosporus, the Ister, etc., suggests that this information is not the collection of one man, but a kind of generic memory such as existed traditionally among the ancient Bulgarians, especially in prescribed history. And perhaps Homer is a collective name, not an individual person. The fact that Homer had knowledge of the Cimmerians leads the chroniclers to date the invasion of the Cimmerians in the age before his. It may be concluded that the Cimmerians inhabited the northern Black Sea coast before the 13th century BC, when the events described in Homer's epic are dated. They are remembered by ancient poets and chroniclers as a harsh and cruel people with their devastating invasions south of the Bosphorus to Ionia, the coast of Asia Minor. Strabo gives us accounts of the Cimmerians as a wandering pirate people who lived on the northern peninsula. We identify it as the Scandinavian peninsula. Strabo transcribes and comments on his predecessor, the geographer Posidonius, who lived a century before him. Posidonius reported that the Cimbri were a wandering pirate people who attacked the area around Lake Meotida, that the Cimmerian Bosporus was named after them because the Greeks identified the Cimbri with the Cimmerians. In their piratical expeditions on the Ister, the Cimbri reached the Galatian Scordians and Tauris at the river Ister. Moreover, and then to the country of the Helvetii, a peaceful people but rich in gold. When the Helvetii saw that the wealth of the Cimbri in their plunder exceeded that of their country, they were so elated that they joined them. They were all afterwards subdued by the Romans. Strabo quotes a number of his predecessors on the peculiar custom of prophesying from human bodies among the Cimbri. They were accompanied in their military detachments by priestess fortune tellers. They were elderly, barefooted, dressed in white capes, tightened with belts and toques. With sword in hand, they walked among the captives, chose their victims, whom they first crowned with wreaths and led to a large bronze vessel. Above it they arranged a platform. There they lift the captives, hang them upside down over the cauldron, and slit the throat of each victim. Some prophesy from the blood, others from the entrails after they cut open the corpse, finally uttering a prophecy of victory for their people. They stretch the skins of the victims on poles raised on their vans and beat them during the battles, extracting a horrible jitney. Strabo confesses that neither he nor any Greek or Roman geographer ever visited the steppes farther north than the Black Sea. Their conceptions far beyond the Danube are vague. What is known is from the ancient Greek historian Ephorus, 4th century BC, and by the tradition of other persons, usually merchants. What there is beyond Germany, what others follow, whether that the Bastani are to be found, as most think, whether among them are the Yazygians or the Roxolani, or some others living in carts, it is difficult to say. Nor whether they are near the ocean, and inhabit the whole coast of it, or whether the country is deserted by the cold, or some other cause, or whether another race of men dwell between the sea and the East Germans. We are in the same ignorance of other more northerly nations. I know neither the Bastani, nor the Saromati, nor at all the peoples living north of the Pontus, at what distance they are from the Atalantean Sea. The Scythians are known to the Greeks from the time of Homer to have inhabited the lands of the Cimmerians north of the mouth of the Danube on the Black Sea coast. Strabo retells that their settlements extended as far north as Bactria, modern-day Afghanistan. For the Bulgarians, Strabo's descriptions are extremely valuable. They give us an objective historical and geographical picture of the location of the tribes throughout the Balkan Peninsula, the Middle and Lower Danube, and the entire Black Sea coast at that time. For almost all the tribes from the Alps and Italy, the Balkans, Egypt and the Middle East, the Black Sea, the Caspian and Aral Seas, Central Asia, to present-day northwest China, their movements and relationships over the millennia and centuries up to the age of Augustus, reported by Strabo, we find that in many ways they manifest themselves as the ethnic fellows of the Scythian Bulgars. And comparing them with the information from the Bulgarian annals, we perceive a great ethno-community in its interconnectedness. So the Hellenes assumed that the Getae were Thracians. The Getae, like the Thracians, lived on both sides of the Ister, as did the Muses, who were also considered Thracians but are now called Mysians. And from these the Mysians were descended, those Muses who now dwell between Lydia, Phrygia, and Troas. And the Phrygians themselves are a Brygian, a Thracian tribe, as are the Mygdonians, the Babricians, the Medonthi, the Vitinians, and the Tinians, and, I believe, also the Mariandynes. All these peoples, of course, have left Europe altogether, but the Muses have remained there. And as evidence appears the view that with the Mysians they associate the Hippomolgians, the Gepactophagi, and the Abyssinians, who in fact represent the Scythians and Sarmatians living in the Fergan. Indeed, even today these tribes, as well as the Bastani, are mixed with the Thracian people, most of them beyond the Ister, and a few this side. The Celts, the Boii, the Scordi, and the Taurais have mingled with them. Posidonius says of the Mysians that they abstain from eating living creatures, and for that reason from their domestic animals, on account of piety. They feed on honey, milk, and cheese, living a peaceful life, and for this reason are called God-fearing and Capnobates. There are also those Thracians who live without women. They are called Tists, and because of the reverence they enjoy they are considered holy for living free from all fear. Of all these peoples the poet speaks as proud Hypomolgi, Galactophagi and Abi, most just men. But he calls them Abi chiefly because they live without women, since, in his opinion, life without a woman is half complete. And he speaks of the Mysians as renowned in hand-to-hand combat because they are invincible, as is the case with all valiant warriors. And they tell of a Geth named Zamolxis, who was the slave of Pythagoras, and learned from him certain things about the heavenly bodies, and other certain things from the Egyptians, since in his wanderings he came as far as Egypt. And when he returned to his own country, he received the respect of the rulers and the people, because he could divine by the signs of heaven. Finally he persuaded the king to take him as his co-ruler, since he was able to proclaim the will of the gods. At first they made him only a priest of the most revered god with them, and then they even began to call him God. And having taken a place in a cave, inaccessible to anyone else, he spent his life there, and very rarely met with outsiders other than the king and his retinue. And the king cooperated with him, for he saw that the people respected him much more than they had done before, in the belief that the laws which he made were in accordance with the counsels of the gods. This custom has been preserved down to our own time, for there has always been a man of such a temper, whom, though he was really only the king's counselor, the Getae called a god. Thus this mountain, with its caves, was recognized as sacred, and so they began to call it, but its name is Kogayanan, like the river which flows by it at the time when Bubista ruled over the Getae, against whom the divine Caesar was already preparing his campaign. This post of honor was held by Desaneus. Somehow the Pythagorean doctrine of abstaining from eating all living things still survived, thanks to the sermons of Zamolxis. In an extramural dispute with the ancient poets, Strabo brings down to us important information about the character and customs of the Scythians. Too rapidly he leads us to the answer to the question, to whom the Scythians resemble, when we compare them by the known relation of the Bulgarian Khan Krum to the skull of the Emperor Nicephorus 7 centuries after Strabo. Hitherto I have spoken of the Thracians and of the Mysians, renowned in hand-to-hand combat and proud Hippomolgians, Abi, milk-eaters, fairest among men. Assert that the poet in his ignorance made no mention of the Scythians, or of their cruelty to foreigners, in sacrificing them, eating their flesh, and using their skulls for drinking cups, insinuated that it was for them that Pontus was called Axinos, but that he invented some proud Hypomolgi, Abi, milk-eaters, fairest among men, peoples who existed nowhere on earth. How else could they have called him Xenos, if they knew not of the cruelty or the most ferocious people? And these, of course, are the Scythians. And weren't the people living beyond the Mysos, Thracians, and Getae also Hippomolgians? Weren't they also Galactophagi and Abi? In fact, even to this day there are so-called cart dwellers and nomads who subsist on their herds, on milk and cheese, and most of all on mare's milk, and who understand nothing of food preservation or of retail trade except the exchange of goods for goods. How, therefore, could the poet be ignorant of the Scythians, since he calls some people Hypomolgi and Galactophagi? That the people of that time called the Scythians Hypomolgi is attested by Hesiod in the words quoted by Eratosthenes, the Ethiopians, the Ligurians, and also the Scythians Hypomolgi. Ephorus, on the other hand, in the fourth book of his History of Europe, having traversed Europe as far as the Scythians, says at the end that the manner of life of the Saromaut and Scythians is similar, for while some are so cruel that they even eat men, others refrain from eating any living creature. For among the nomad Scythians there are some who feed only on the milk of the mare and excel all other men in justice. And they are mentioned also by Hesiod in his so-called Tour of the Earth, when he says that Phineus was led by the Harpies to the land of the Galactophagi, who live in carts. Ephorus explains the reason by saying that, as they have a humble life and are not greedy for money, they not only live in justice among themselves, having all their things in common, wives, children, and all kinship, but also remain unconquered and unconquered by outsiders, because they have nothing to be enslaved for. Dromicetes was king of the Getae in the time of Alexander the Diadochi. He, having captured alive Lysimachus, who led a campaign against him, first showed him his own poverty, as well as that of his tribe, and also their independence of others, and then persuaded him not to make war with such nations, but to treat them as a friend. And after telling him this, he first received him as a guest and made friendship with him, and then released him. Even in our own time Elias Cato removed from the land beyond the Ister into Thrace 50,000 of the Getae, a tribe of the same language as the Thracians in Thrace, and there now live what are called the Mysians, either because in early times they were so called also, and only in Asia has their name been changed to Demui. Concerning the Getae, their ancient history I will pass over, but what is connected with the present times is this. Burebistas, a Getae, after imposing his authority over the tribe, succeeded in reviving the people, whose condition had deteriorated from frequent wars, and raised them up to such an extent by means of physical exercise, abstinence, and obedience, that in a few years he established a powerful state, and subjected to the Getae most of their neighboring peoples. And he began to frighten the Romans by daringly crossing the Ister and plundering Thrace as far as Macedonia and Illyrida, and mingling with the Thracians and Illyrians not only devastated the Celts, but even completely eliminated the Boeotians of Cretacerius, also the Taurians. For the complete subjugation of his tribe he had for a confederate Decianus, a magician, who had not only traversed all Egypt, but had also learned certain prophetic arts, by means of which he pretended to utter the divine will, and he was soon proclaimed a god, as I have said in connection with Zamalxans. The following is an instance of their complete submission. They were compelled to cut down their vines and live without wine. Some, however, rose up against Burebistas, Bubista, and he was deposed before the Romans sent an army against him, and those who succeeded him divided his dominion into several parts. In fact, it was not until recently, when Augustus Caesar sent an expedition against them, that his dominion was divided into 5 parts, whereas before the revolt it had been into 4. The Dacians, in my opinion, in ancient times were called Daui. Hence the slave names Geta and Daus which prevail in Attica. This is more plausible than that the name Day derives from the Scythians. For they lived far around Hyrcania, and it is not reasonable to suppose that slaves were brought to Attica from there, and the inhabitants of Attica were in the habit of calling their domestic slaves after the nations from which they came, as Lydian or Syrian. Through the country of the Getae, the Meris River entered into the Danube, on which the Romans moved equipment needed for war. The upper reaches of the Ister, from the sources to the headwaters, call it the Danube, that is, that part of the river which flows mostly in the land of the Dacians, while the reaches of the river near Pontus, where the river runs through the country of the Getae, call it the Ister. The Dacians and the Getae speak the same language among the Hellenes, However, the Gitai are more familiar because the migrations they make on both sides of the Ister are continuous and because they are mixed with the Thracians and the Mysians. The tribe of the Tribals, also Thracian, experience the same mixture. They have often adopted migrations into this country because the neighboring peoples have forced them into the land of the weaker, that is to say, the Scythians, Bastanians, and Sormrats on the other side of the river have often so far prevailed as to cross it to attack those whom they have already driven out, and some of them remain there, either on the islands or in Thrace, while those who remain on the other side are generally overrun by the Illyrians. Anyhow, though the Getaean Dacians had once recovered so much as to be able to send a military expedition of 200,000 men, they are now reduced to only 40,000, and will soon be subdued by the Romans, though they are not yet quite subdued, for they pin their hopes on the Germans, who are hostile to the Romans. In the space beside the Pontine Sea, between the Ister and Tyre, is the Gathian Desert, entirely flat and arid, in which Darius, the son of Hystaspes, found himself when he crossed the Ister to attack the Scythians, and was in danger of perishing of thirst with his whole army. But, though belatedly, he realized his mistake and returned. And later on, Lysimachus in his expedition against the Getaean king Dromicetes not only put himself at risk but was indeed captured, but he too was saved because of the barbarians' magnanimity, as I said before. Near the estuary there is a large island called Puke, and when the Bastani conquered it they received the nickname of the Pevkin. There are other islands which are much smaller, some of them are farther inland than Puke, while others are near the sea, for the river has 7 mouths. The largest of these is called the Sacred Estuary, by which one may sail off the Puke inland for 120 stadia. It was at the lower part of the Puke that Darius made his pontoon bridge, though the bridge could have been built at the upper part. The Sacred Estuary is the first on one's right as one sails towards the Pontus, the others come in order afterwards as one sails along the coast towards Tiras, and the distance from it to the 7th estuary is about 300 stadia. Small islands are formed between the mouths. The 3 estuaries which come in order after the Sacred Estuary are small, but the others are smaller than it, but larger than the 3. According to Euphoros, however, the Ister has only 5 mouths. From thence to Tiras, a navigable river, the distance is 900 stadia. And between them are 2 large lakes, one of which flows into the sea, so that it may be used for a harbour, but the other is without an estuary. At the mouth of the Tiras is the so-called Tower of Neopolem, and also the so-called village of Hermanax. And in sailing inward 140 stadia one comes to 2 cities, one on each side, Niconia and Arpheus on the left. But the people who dwell near the river speak of a city 120 stadia inland. 500 stadia from the mouth is the island of Leuc, dedicated to Achilles, an ark entering the open sea. Then is the river Borysthene, which is navigable at a distance of 600 stadia. Close by follows another river, the Hypanis, and at the mouth of the Borysthene there is a harbour. On sailing 200 stadia up the Borysthene one comes to a town of the same name as the river, but the same town is also called Olbia. It is a great trading centre and was founded by the Miltans. The whole country above the coast in question between the Borysthene and the Ister comprises first the Gothic Desert, then the Tregete, and after them the Iasigan Sarmatians and the so-called Basilae and the Urgites, who are mostly nomads, though few of them are engaged in agriculture. These peoples, it is said, dwell also about the Ister, often on both sides. And in the interior dwell first those Bastani, whose country borders on that of the Tyagetes and Germans, being themselves of the German race, and divided into several tribes. For some of them are called Artmen and Sidonians, while those who have taken possession of Puke, the island in the Ister, are called Pevkin, and the Roxolanians, the most northern of them, rule the plains between Tanais and Borysthene. In fact, all the land north of Germany to the Caspian Sea, so far as we know it, is plain. Whether there are inhabitants beyond the Roxolans we do not know. The Roxolani, under Thasius, had also fought with the strategists of Mithridates. Eupator had come to the aid of Palakos, the son of Silurus, as his allies, and had the reputation of being a warlike people, but barbarians and lightly armed warriors were weak compared with a well-ordered and well-armed phalanx. The Prokians, who numbered about 50,000, were no match for the fighters of Diophantus, the strategos of Mithridates, and most were slain. They used shields and breastplates made of ox hides, and wore shields woven of rods, and for weapons they had spears, bow, and sword, and most of the other barbarians were so armed. As for the Pomads, their tents made of felt are tied to the wagons in which they spend their lives, and around the tents are the flocks which provide the milk, cheese, and meat on which they subsist. And they follow the grazing flocks, moving now and then to other places where there is grass, and living only in the marshy meadows round Lake Meotida in winter, and on the plains in summer. The whole country has harsh winters as far north as the seaside districts between Boristen and the mouth of Lake Meotida, but of the districts themselves which are by the sea the most northerly are the mouth of Meotida, and still further north the mouth of Boristen and the inland bay of Tamiurax, or Karkinitis, which is the isthmus of the greater Chersonesus. The climate in these areas, although they live in the plains, is cold, so they do not raise the donkey, an animal that is sensitive to cold. As for their cattle, some are born without horns, and the horns of others are branched, because that part of the animal is sensitive to cold, and their horses are small, while their sheep are large, and their bronze hydria burst, and their contents freeze. But the severity of their frosts is most evident from what takes place in the region of the mouth of Lake Meotida. The water road from Pantikopias to Phanagoria is traversed by carts, though it is both a water road and a land road. And they catch the fish in the ice by digging a hole with an implement called a gangame, especially the Antichaia, which are the size of dolphins. It is said of Neoptolemus, the strategos of Mithridates, that in the same strait he defeated the barbarians in a sea battle in summer and in a horse battle in winter. It seems that Ateas, who was at war with Philip, the son of Amintas, had dominion over most of the barbarians in that part of the world. Beyond the island, situated in front of Boristen, and towards sunrise, sail to the promontory of Achilles Dromos, which promontory, though unwooded, is called also S and is dedicated to Achilles. Then comes Achilles Dromos, a peninsula, which is low and flat. It is a ribbon-shaped strip of land up to 1,000 stadia long, extending eastward. Its greatest breadth is only 2 stadia, and its least only 4 plethra, and it is only 60 stadia from the mainland on either side of the isthmus. It is sandy, and water can be brought up by digging. The neck of the isthmus is near the center of the peninsula, and is about 40 stadia wide. It terminates in a promontory called Tamirake, which is a landing place against the mainland. And after this promontory comes the Bay of Karkinitis. It is very large, reaching as far north as 1,000 stadia, according to some. However, the distance inland is 3 times as great. The people there are called Tafrians. The bay is also called Tamirake, after the name of the promontory. Studies of Homer's epic indicate that the writing of the Iliad and the Odyssey took place in the 6th century BC, and that Homer, the reputed author of the epic, lived in the 8th century BC and most likely came from Ionia. The details of his biography are lost in antiquity. Homer is believed to have been a genius Eid who collected and unified into a single whole the orally transmitted epic poems. It is quite logical, moreover, that he changed many things, texts, the factology that existed, the legends and legends that accompanied them, in order to unite them and give them a logical and complete form consistent with Greek theology and pantheon, with a beginning, a development and an end. For about 2 centuries these poems have been orally transmitted, and have now a somewhat more complete Homeric form. Such have come down to us in several records. And for generations before him, at least 400 years after the Trojan events, scores of Aedi passed this epic from mouth to mouth. It is not known specifically of what nationality the origin of these Aedi was, but it is quite equally conceivable that they were of Asia Minor, Thracian, Greek, etc., origin in a narrow sense, and in a broad sense, generically speaking, Bulgarian, as is evident from the populations of Asia Minor and the Balkans according to the Bulgarian annals, each having also contributed in his own way to the enrichment and modification of the plots, characters, names, language, etc. Certain controversies arise about the origin and residence of Achilles. While the Greek epic indicates that he was a native of the Greek region of Thia, Greek historiography, geography, and legend constantly refer us to the northern Black Sea coast. Specific descriptions of Achilles' sandy side, which still exists today, provide grounds for a more convincing hypothesis of Achilles' non-Greek origins. According to Homer's description in the Iliad, Achilles is blonde-haired. In his own words, "I have not come here for Trojan spearmen, to fight with them, for they are guilty of nothing. Never have they plundered my horses and cows, never have they, in the fertile and vine-harvesting FTA, wiped me out, that we are inaccessibly separated by a string of thick-shaded mountains, and the sea is yawning." It seems that he is not a typical Ali. His homeland, where horses and cows are raised in a fertile land that grows grapes and cereals, lies behind thick green forests and a stormy sea. This is a poetic description of the fertile fields, corresponding rather to the northern Black Sea coast, beyond the Rhodope, the Haemus and the Carpathians, and the inhospitable Pontus, than to the stony and dry lands without tall vegetation in Hellas. According to Homer and Strabo, in these areas, around the mouth of the Dnieper from the 16th century BC certainly lived Cimmerians, or Cimmerians. According to the Bulgarian chronicles, they were Cimmerians, Saumari, i.e. Bulgarians. Ancient authors say that Achilles was a native of the northern Black Sea coast, and it is admissible to assume that he was an ethnic Bulgarian from the local tribes, offshoots of the nationality group of the ancient Bulgarians. Here is the isthmus which separates the so-called Lake Sapra from the sea. It is 40 stadia wide, and forms the so-called Taurian or Scythian Chersonese. Some, however, assert that the isthmus has a width of 360 stadia. But though the Lake of Sapra is said to be 4,000 stadia in extent, it is only the western part of the Lake of Meotiда, to which it is connected by a wide estuary. It is very marshy, and is scarcely navigable by means of sown boats, for the winds strip the shallows and then cover them again with water, and the marshes are therefore impassable for larger boats. There are 3 small islands in the bay, as well as several shoals and reefs along the shore. As you sail out of the bay, there is a small town on the left and another harbour, which is the Chersonese. As one sails along the shore, there is a large promontory beyond, which runs southward and is part of the whole of Chersonese. Here is the city of the Heracleotians, a colony of the Heracleotians who live on the Pontus 6, and this place itself is called Chersonese, which is at a distance in coast navigation of 4,400 stadia from Terras. Then there is the old Chersonese, which has been razed to the ground, and beyond it there is a bay with a narrow mouth, where the common Takan Taurus, a Scythian tribe, used to gather their pirates to attack those who sought refuge here. It is called the Cumberland Limen. This bay forms with another bay, called the Tennant Limen, an isthmus 40 stadia wide. And this is the isthmus which closes the Lesser Chersonese, which, as I have said, is a part of the Greater Chersonese, and in it is the city of Chersonese, which bears the same name as the peninsula. This city was originally autonomous, but after the barbarians had ruined it they were forced to choose Mithridates Eupator as their protector. He then led an army against the barbarians living across the isthmus as far as Borysthenes. This was in preparation for a campaign against the Romans. Because of these hopes of his, he gladly sent an army to Chersonese, at the same time waging war against the Scythians, not only against Cylleron, but also against the sons of Cylleron, Palacinus and the rest, who according to Posidonius were 50 in number, but according to Apollonides were 80. He then not only subdued them all by force, but also established himself as master of Bosporus, receiving the country as a voluntary gift from Pericades. Who ruled it? From that time to this day the city of the Chersonesides has been subject to the dynasts of Bosporus. Tenus Limanus is equidistant from the city of the Chersonese and from Cumberland Limanus. And beyond Cumberland Liman to the city of Theodosia is the Taurian coast, which is about 1,000 stadia long. It is rugged, mountainous, and subject to violent north winds, and near the same mountainous region is another mountain, the Cimmerian, so called because the Cimmerians once ruled Bosporus. Because of this fact, the entire isthmus stretching to the mouth of Lake Meotida is called the Cimmerian Bosporus. Beyond the aforementioned mountainous region in a fertile plain lies the city of Theodosia, where there is also a bay that can accommodate up to 100 ships. This bay once formed the boundary between the lands of the Bosporians and the Thebans. And the land beyond that of Theodosia is also fertile as far as Pantikopaea, the metropolis of the Bosporians, situated at the mouth of Lake Meotida. The distance between Theodosia and Pantikopaea is about 530 stadia. The whole district is fertile in grain, and there are villages and a town called Nymphion, with a fine bay. Pantikopaea is a height inhabited on all sides in a circle of 20 stadia. East of it is a bay and wharves for about 30 ships. There is also an acropolis. It is a colony of the Miltecs. For a long time it was ruled as a monarchy by the dynasties of Leucon, Satyrus, and Pericades, and all the neighboring settlements at the mouth of Lake Meotida on either side, until Pericades surrendered power to Mithridates. They were called tyrants, though most of them, beginning with Pirisad and Leucon, were just rulers. And Pericades was even worshipped as a god. The last of these monarchs also bore the name Pirisad, but he could not hold out against the barbarians, who continually imposed a heavier tribute than before, and because of this he ceded power to Mithridates Eupator. But from the time of Mithridates the kingdom was subject to the Romans. The greater part of it was situated in Europe, and another part was in Asia. The mouth of Lake Meotida is called the Cimmerian Bosporus. At first it is quite wide, about 70 stages. Here the people are transferred from the regions of Pantikopaea to Phanagoria, the nearest city of Asia. It ends in a much narrower strait. It divides Asia from Europe. Together is the river Tanais, which lies directly opposite it and flows from the north into the lake and then to its mouth. The river has two mouths in the lake, which are about 60 stadia apart. There is also a town of the same name as the river, and near Pantikopaeus is the greatest marketplace of the barbarians. On the left, on entering the Cimmerian Bosporus by water, there is a small town, Myrmekion, at a distance of 20 stadia from Pantikopaeus. And at a distance of 2 geats more from Myrmekion is the village of Parthenion. Here the strait is narrowest, about 20 stadia, and on the opposite side, in Asia, is the village called Achilleon. From thence, if one sails straight to Tanais and the islands near its mouth, the distance is 2,200 stadia, but if one sails along the coast of Asia, the distance is slightly increased. If, however, one sails from the left to Tanais, following the coast where the isthmus is situated, the distance is over 3 GDY more. The whole coast on this side, I mean the European, is desert, but the coast on the right is not desert, and the whole circumference of the lake is reported to be 9,000 stadia. The Greater Chersonese is similar to the Peloponnesus both in shape and size. It was ruled by the dynasties of Bosporus, though the whole was ravaged by prolonged wars, but in earlier times only a small part of it, that which is near the mouth of Lake Meotida and as far as Pantikopaeus, and reaches to Theodosia, was held by the tyrants of Bosporus, while the greater part of it, as far as the isthmus and the Gulf of Carcinitis, was held by the Thebri, a Scythian tribe. And all this country, with the land beyond the isthmus as far as Borysthene, was called Lesser Scythia. But on account of the large population which abandoned Lesser Scythia, and went beyond the Taras and the Ister, and settled in the land beyond, no small part of Thrace also came to be called Lesser Scythia, the Thracians having retreated partly on account of strength, and partly on account of the poor quality of the land, most of it being marshy. Here was also the port of Tennis. In order to be able to hold out, the strategists of Mithridates fortified it, placed a garrison on the aforementioned promontory, and filled in that part of the mouth of the bay which goes to the city, so that there was now an easy way by land, and in a sense one city was obtained instead of two. The peculiar thing about all the Scythian and Sarmatian people is that they hobbled their horses to make them more docile. Because even though the horses are small, they are extremely fast and difficult to train. As for game, there are deer and wild boar in the marshes, and wild asses and roe deer in the plains. The other peculiarity is that the eagle is not found in these places. And among the quadrupeds there is an animal called a colossus. It is between a deer and a ram in stature, is white, and is swifter than either of them, drinks through the nostrils of its head, and is afterwards kept for several days from the stock, so that it can easily live in an arid land. Such seems to be all the land that is beyond the rivers Ister and Tanais as far as the Pontine Sea and Meotida. The rest of Europe includes the land that is between the Ister and the surrounding sea, starting from the interior of the Adriatic and extending to the holy estuary of the Ister. In this land are Eladia and the tribes of the Macedonians and the Epirotes, and all those tribes above them whose lands reach to the Ister and the seas on either side, the Adriatic and the Pontine to the Adriatic Illyrian tribes, and at the other sea to the Propontis and the Hellespont, the Thracian tribes and the Scythian or Celtic tribes mixed with them. From the Pontus rises Mount Haemus, the largest and highest of all the mountains in that part of the world, and crosses Thrace almost in the middle. Polybius asserts that the two seas are visible from the mountain, but this is false, for the distance to the Adriatic is great, and the things which hide the view are many. On the other hand, almost all of Odria is close to the Adriatic. Paeonia is in the middle and is all mountainous. Paeonia is bounded on two sides, first on the Thracian parts by Rhodope, a mountain second in height only to Haemus, and secondly, on the other side, to the north, by the Illyrian parts, by the land of the Autorati and the Dardani. The Scordisks lived on the Ister and were divided into two tribes called the Greater Scordisks and the Lesser Scordisks. The former lived between the two rivers that flowed into the Ister, the Noaros, which ran past Segestica and Margos, while the Lesser Scordisk lived across that river, on the isthmus, grappling with the Tribals and Mysians. After the country of the Scordi, along the Ister comes that of the Tribals and the Mysos, and the marshes of what is called Little Scythia, which is on this side of the Ister. These people, as well as the Crobrygians and the so-called Troglodytes, live over the area around Calatis, Tomis, and the Ister. Then come the inhabitants around Mount Haemus and beyond, and stretching as far as the Pontus. I am speaking of the Corals, the Besses, some of the Medes, and the Lancites. By the way, all these tribes are robber tribes, but the Besses, who inhabit the greater part of Mount Haemus, even the robbers call them robbers. The Besses live in huts and lead a wretched life, and their land borders on the Rhodope Mountains, on the land of the Paeonians, and on that of the Illyrians, the Autarians, and the Dardanians. Between them and the Ardians are the Dassarites, the Agrians, and other insignificant tribes, whom the Scordians have continually ravaged until they have depopulated the land and made it full of impassable forests at the distance of a few days' journey. The land between the Ister and the mountains includes that part of the Pontic coast, from the sacred estuary of the Ister to the mountainous territory adjacent to Haemus, as far as the mouth at Vinsantium. The coast, though it falls outside the mountain line, nevertheless terminates at a convenient boundary, the mouth of the Pontus. If, therefore, one goes to the sacred mouth of the Ister, and breezes along the coast on the right, one comes, at a distance of 500 stadia, to a small town, Istros, founded by the Miletians, then to a second small town, Tomi, are 250 stadia, then are 280 stadia to the town of Calates, a colony of the Heracleotians, then, at 1,300 stadia, is Apollonia, a colony of the Miletians. The greater part of Apollonia was founded on an island, where there is a temple of Apollo, from which Marcus Lucullus carried away the great statue of Apollo, the work of Calamides, and placed it in the capital. In the stretch between Calates and Apollonia there are also Bienzone, a considerable part of which was destroyed by an earthquake, Cruni, Odessos, a colony of the Miltons, and Nablochos, a small settlement of the Mesumrians. Then comes Mount Haemus, which here reaches the sea, then Mesumviria, a colony of the Megarians, originally called Menebria, i.e. the city of Minas, because its founder was Minas, while Bria is the word for city in Thracian. Similarly, the city of Celis is called Salubria, and Ennis was once called Poltumbria. Then comes Anchiales, a small town of the Apollonians, and Apollonia itself. On this coastline is Cape Tyrrhisis, a fortification once used by Lysimachus as a treasury. Again, the distance from Apollonia to the Cyanea is about 1,500 stadia, and between them are Tinia, the territory of the Apollonians, Anchiale, which is also of the Apollonians, and Phenopolis and Andriaca, which borders on Salmudissos. Salmudissos is a desert and rocky coast, unfit for a harbour, and wide open to the north winds, and extending lengthwise as far as the Cyanea, a distance of about 700 stadia, and all who are shipwrecked on this coast are plundered by the Asti, the Thracian tribes situated above it. The Cyanea are two islets near the mouth of the Pontus, one near Europe, the other near Asia. They are separated by a strait of about 20 stadia, and are 12 stadia distant from the temple of the Byzantines and the temple of the Chalcedonians. And this is the narrowest part of the mouth of the Euxine, for by going on 10 stadia more, one comes to a land which makes the isthmus only 5 stadia wide, and then it widens more and begins to form the Propontis. From the bow, which forms a strait of 5 stadia, to the bay called Under the Fig Tree is 35 stadia, and thence to the Horn of Byzantium, 5 stadia. The horn in front of the wall of Byzantium is a bay which continues roughly westward for a distance of 60 stadia, resembling a stag's horn, split into many coves, like some branches into which the bonito enter, which are easily caught on account of their great number and the force of the current, which gathers them into the narrowness of the coves, so that they are caught even with their hands. These fish spawn in the marshes of Meotida, and when they have gained a little strength, they rush across the mouth of the Lake of Pasgi and take the Asiatic coast as far as Trapezunt and Pharyakia. There first the hunt for the fish begins, though it is slight, for it has not yet reached its usual size. But by the time it reaches Sinope, it is mature enough for catching and salting. But as soon as they reach the Cyaneans and pass them, the creatures are so frightened by a white rock which juts out from the Chalcedonian shore, that they turn directly to the opposite shore. There the current catches them, and as the region is so shaped by nature as to turn the sea current there towards Byzantium and the Horn, they are naturally drawn thither, and thus offer to the Byzantines and Romans a considerable yield. But the Chalcedonians, though situated near, but on the opposite shore, receive no share of this abundance, because the Palamon does not approach their bays, hence the tale of Apollo, when the men who founded Byzantium after the foundation of Chalcedon by the Megarians consulted the oracle, he commanded them to make their settlement against the blind, calling the Chalcedonians blind, because, though they had sailed round these parts at an earlier time, they had not conquered the opposite land with such wealth, but had chosen the poorer. I have carried my description as far as Byzantium, because a famous town situated nearest the estuary marks a more comprehensible boundary of the coast voyage than the Ister. And above Byzantium is situated the nation of the Asti, where is the city of Calliope, where Philip the son of Amyntas settled the most brutal people of his kingdom. Hecataeus of Miletus reports of the Peloponnesus that before the Hellenes it was inhabited by barbarians. It may be said that in antiquity almost the whole of Hellas was inhabited by barbarians, which may be inferred from the traditions themselves. The Pelops brought people from Phrygia to Peloponnesus, which is named after him, the Danae from Egypt, and the Dryopes, the Corconians, the Pelasgians, the Lelegians, and the like, divided among themselves the Isthmus of Isthmus, within and without. Thus Attica was once ruled by the Thracians, who came with Eumolpus 10 Davlida in Phocis by the Therians, Cadmea by the Phoenicians, who came with Cadmus, and Boeotia itself by the Ionians, Themians, and Hyands. Pindar says that the Boeotian tribe was once called Seus. The barbarian origin of some is evident from their names: Kekrops, Kodros, Ikel, Kotos, Drumars, and Kronakos. And even to this day Thracians, Illyrians, and Epiros live on the outskirts of the Hellenes. Of course there were more barbarians before than there are today. In fact, most of the country that is now undisputedly Hellas was ruled by the barbarians, Macedonia and some parts of Thessaly by the Thracians, and parts of Acarnania and Aetolia by the Thesproti, Cassopians, Amphilochs, Molossians, and Athemanians, the Epirus tribes.